Hi, my name is Andi. I'm a chaotic reader, and as you can see from the title, in this video I will be tier ranking all the 35 books I read in 2024. Looking at my Storygraph stats for the year, my most read genres are still fantasy, romance, young adult and contemporary fiction, which honestly tracks. But I didn't realize I read quite a few historical fiction stories in 2024 too. Nice. I'm not gonna show the rankings overview because that's what we are here for today. I had a bit of a hard time coming up with the tier names, but in the end I settled on the following. I will not stop talking about these. It's gonna be our top tier. Then one below is gonna be delivered what it should. These are books that met my expectations or even exceeded them a little bit, but somehow not enough to really become a top tier book for me. Then in the middle we have solid mid tier, which are gonna be books which were not bad per se, but for some reason I just found them okay. This is by no means a negative tier, but these books were just a mid-reading experience for me. And more on the negative end of the scale we have I finished them, but why? And Never Again, Thank You, which I think are very self-explanatory. I feel like this reading year for me is not gonna be very top tier heavy. That being said, there were a couple highlight reads, but also a whole lot of letdowns, mostly in the middle of the year. And there were also quite a few stories that made me slide right into a reading slump. As I rank these, I will be sharing my opinions on them very briefly, just to give you an idea if you would want to pick them up or if you want to avoid them. But I won't be diving into the plot details very much, and as always I will try to keep it spoiler free. We have tea, we have the screen recording set up. Let's go. I kind of want to go backwards and start with the books that I've read recently, just because they are the freshest in my mind. So we should start with Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, which is a Japanese contemporary fiction story in every sense of the genre. So it's very slow moving, very introspective, more a collection of scenes around the main character rather than a linear storyline. I've read this over a 2 months period, every time I was taking the public transport, and maybe that's why it felt a bit fragmented, but there were a lot of emotional turning points in the story that happened sort of off page, and I wish they were included a little bit more. So that kind of puts it for me in the solid mid-tier category. That being said, I'm gonna continue my quest on finding hidden gem Japanese fiction books also this year. Then for Christmas, I was reading The Elven Days of Christmas, which I have other 2 books from this author that I also read this year, one at the beginning of the year and one the sequel in the middle of the year. But this one is a silly little Christmas fantasy rom-com, which was just perfect for the holidays. It was sweet, it was funny. There were no annoying miscommunication tropes in it, there were no high-stakes quests and very complex world building. It just delivered what it should for a Christmas fantasy rom-com. So that puts it into the delivered what they should category. Next up, let's go with Phantasma. Phantasma for me was a bit of a mixed experience. It felt a little bit like Ninth House, mixed with a bit, what's the name of the book? With The Serpent and the Wings of Night. And the male love interest, Blackwell I think his name was also a bit Jax coded. I mean Jax from Once Upon a Broken Heart series, which is one of my all-time favorites. So in that regard, it was right up my alley. And yet, I feel like the story did not live up to the level of these other books that I just mentioned, although the romance had great chemistry and great tension. But what I was missing is the execution of the trials and this sort of haunted mansion plotline. I would say it delivered what it should. I recommend it if you like the books I just mentioned, because it does resemble them in certain elements, but nothing life-changing, I'm afraid. I would then put it delivered what it should, but more like on the lower end of it, somewhere close to solid mid-tier. Okay, let's go for something else. Talking about life-changing, I finally picked up the second and last part of We Hunt the Flame, which is We Free the Stars. The central themes around loneliness, finding and losing your identity, and forging bonds with people around you were done so well. We all know that I love a pining, tortured prince who is also an assassin. Especially because in this book he goes from, let's be honest, he goes from emotionally stunted to growing to embrace his emotions, and for that alone, this book deserves top tier. However, disclaimer, the ending felt a bit underwhelming. I struggled a lot going through the last 20% or so. The stakes just didn't feel that high. Okay, next. Let's go with Blood and Steel. Blood and Steel honestly caught my eye when it was described as a Witcher-inspired romantasy, and honestly, it did deliver on that front. It was also realistic in terms of going through trials and challenging situations for the main character to get stronger and get more like fighting training, versus the cliche instant gaining of powers that is also very often found in romantasy these days. It was a good time, but I cannot say I thought much about this book ever since finishing it months ago. But all that being said, it delivered what it should, so it deserves to sit in that tier. If I wanna go like chronologically what I read, oopsie, the Christmas tree is wobbling a little bit, please excuse it. So let's do Good Girl, Bad Blood, which is a sequel to A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. I read this together with my husband, and we both agree that in terms of the mystery and how it got revealed, the first book was stronger. Which means that Good Girl, Bad Blood kind of goes into the solid mid-tier, and then A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. It was actually my first time reading young adult mystery or thriller story, and I had a lot of fun collecting the clues. So for me personally, A Good Girl's Guide to Murder delivered exactly what it should. So that's where it goes. Let's look more at the negative end of the scale. Ow, my leg fell asleep. Hold on. Unforgiven. I have no excuses for this one. I wanted to read a story where there are university professors and one of them turns out to be an agent undercover of some sort. I will not make this mistake again. Never again, thank you. Okay, Peaches and Honey. Peaches and Honey. This was a standout among the fantasy books simply because it followed immortality and the loneliness that comes with it. And the story took place over several centuries, so the build-up was definitely not rushed. That being said, the world building was a bit murky, and the central conflict also felt a bit lukewarm, but the central themes delivered what it should. Hopefully in the sequel we get more answers, and the world building will also get a little bit of a stronger foundation. So Peaches and Honey delivered what it should. Could have delivered a little bit more though. Right, then Immortal Dark. Immortal Dark, on the surface, had everything. Dark academia setting, vampires and kind of like power struggles of families, and a mystery plotline. It turned out to be not entirely my cup of tea, to be honest. It was a lot darker and a lot more graphic than I expected. This is not your usual, oh, he's my enemy, I hate him but find him hot kind of dynamic. This is the I literally wish him bodily harm. I felt like the story lacked strong side characters, and the whole mystery plot was honestly a bit useless. So for that, I can only rank it within the solid mid-tier. Oopsie. Why do I always end up grabbing the wrong one? Let me know what you thought though, because I've heard people rate it very high or rather low. I was kind of in the middle, so I'm wondering what's your take on it. Then let's go up to the top tier, easy, Forest of Dreams and Whispers. This was honestly one of my 5-star predictions for myself, because I picked this one up after hearing Carrie's praise from Carrie Can Read, and it was spot on. If you like characters like Howl or Wendell from Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, you will like this one. Definitely put the author on my radar to check for other Fae stories as well. So definitely a top tier book, and I will not stop talking about it. After that, let's do a little bit of a letdown. The Gilded Wolves. This one was a big letdown for me personally, because I was so prepared to love this, but it just didn't work for me. I felt like the relationship web was a bit flimsy. I didn't feel the connections as intensely as, for example, in The Six of Crows, which it gets compared to a lot, but I feel like in general the characters and their troubles, their aspirations, their hopes, their dreams, they didn't feel that close in The Gilded Wolves. It was a bit like viewing everything from afar, and same goes for the conflict, to be honest. So I'm a little bit conflicted. Would I say it was a solid mid-tier? I didn't regret finishing, so I wouldn't go I finished them but why, but I can only rank it a solid mid-tier and more on the lower end of it, because it was still missing, like the premise was really good, but the execution just fell short in my opinion. Okay, let's go for another one of my adventurous reads, which was Broken Bonds. Safe to say, this, I want to say never again thank you, but to be fully transparent, I was in a reading slump at that point, and I read this within like 2 days, and it pulled me out of it completely. I immediately jumped into the second book, but that was the quickest DNF of the year, so it did what it should, but never again thank you. Going a bit more lighthearted, let's go with Summoned to the Wilde, which was a sequel to Thrown in the Dark. And as much as I love the first part, in comparison, this was a bit of a letdown. It felt like a filler. I mean, it's the second book, so it can happen. And I feel like what made the first book amazing is it's not really the plot. Like, the plot is very, okay, we understand what's going on, but the pining vibes. And in the sequel, the pining vibes were also not there, that elevated the first book. So, that being said, I wouldn't say that it delivered what it should. I would say it was more of a solid mid-tier. Oof, let's jump right to Circe. Circe was emotional. It was, how I like to describe it is that it showcased the tragedy and the loneliness of immortality. Actually, initially I thought about putting it in the delivered what it should, but if I think about it more, I think it deserves the highest tier, because I think this also gonna be a book that I will think about often, also in the future, and I'm also probably gonna mention it when I review other books. So for that reason, Circe deserves the I will not stop talking about these tier. If I follow this kind of reasoning, then the next one in the highest tier has to be This Is How You Lose the Time War. It deserves the highest tier for the lyrical and very visceral, I think this is the right word, visceral, descriptions and the whole time travel mind-bending. It's a short read, very unique when it comes to storytelling, definitely recommend it. Then, for something else, what did I read at the same time as This Is How You Lose the Time War? I read Just for the Summer. Obviously, like during the summer, I also made a reading vlog about it, which kind of went sideways because I was in a major reading slump with these two books, somehow. So, Just for the Summer is a bit tough for me because it is marketed as a love story, and I think the love story part was the weakest. So it's hard to say that it delivered what it should. That being said, The characters and how they themselves work through their things were interesting and so well done, but the romance couldn't really draw me in. I didn't really feel the chemistry, I didn't really understand. I couldn't really understand why these two people were drawn to each other. So for that, it kind of has to go into the solid mid-tier, but I would say more on the upper end of it. Just for the characters and the representation of, for example, mental health issues. I don't like the English word issue for like mental health stuff, whatever. Let's go back to fantasy, A Fate Inked in Blood. Yeah, if you take the first part of A Fate Inked in Blood, it deserves the delivered what it should, maybe even like exceeding expectations. But if you take the last part, I would put it in I finished it, but why? And the reason for that is because I did not vibe with the ending and all the predictability. So if the first part is top tier, the ending is kinda low tier, that would put it in the middle, right? So A Fate Inked in Blood, solid mid tier. I wish they did the ending better, that's all I'm gonna say. 6 Crimson Cranes, let's go with that one. So 6 Crimson Cranes is kind of a mixture of a Chinese costume drama, Chinese mythology and other folklore retellings, which means all the good things and all the bad things. So there's very little character depth, I would say, and you kind of know where the story is going. I didn't have any major issues with it, to be honest, but it also didn't leave much of a lasting impression, so to the solid mid tier it goes. Let's do a bit of a controversial take. So Heartless Hunter. I'm so surprised when people rank Heartless Hunter high on their ratings, because it was a very disappointing read for me. There was so much potential in the witch and witch hunter romance with deception and scheming and spying on each other, but the conflict made me want to tear my hair out. And after like the 85% mark, everything went downhill. I did not agree with certain character decisions there. Let's just say it like that. I was so disappointed when I read it that I questioned myself, why did I even finish it when I clearly disliked the direction the story was going. Very low chance of me picking up the sequel, even though I loved the premise. I loved the deception, each of them have their own reason why they are approaching the other, scheming. World building was fine, but the character decisions for the end game, I finished it, but why? Why did I do this to myself? Okay, let's go with The Familiar. Solid mid tier. I had high expectations because so far every one of Lee Bardugo's books that I have read impressed me a lot, but The Familiar kind of failed to do that. Not sure if it was the timing. I was kind of in a reading slump, but the thing I felt was a letdown is that the stakes did not feel high by the end, and the characters also somehow did not feel interesting. So, solid mid-tier, I'm sorry. Okay, let's get this one out of the way. Only a Monster, if you watch my videos, I think I mentioned it in the mid-year reading wrap-up. I have so many bones to pick with this story. It's unbelievable. From the tone of voice to the glaring plot holes and super random character decision making that just makes no sense. Like, I think I said this before, one of my biggest pet peeves is when the characters have no idea what to do, okay? But then nothing happens that would make them arrive to their next decision. They just suddenly they just know. Never again, thank you. Am I being a bit mean to the books? I mean, maybe, but this is how I felt reading them, so there's that. Okay, let's go to the more positive side of things. Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands delivered what it should. The main character was still refreshing. There was still a small-scale adventure, this time in Austria, which I might be biased because I live in Austria currently. So it delivered what it should. I can definitely recommend it if you are thinking about picking it up. I haven't really talked about contemporary romance books a lot yet, even though I read a few, So let's go better than the movies. Originally, I rated better than the movies 4 stars, but now that months have passed, I might need to rethink it because it just wasn't that memorable, to be honest. It was enjoyable as a cheesy rom-com, but kind of quick to forget. So for that alone, I would say it belongs to the solid mid-tier. I feel like my commentary is also getting shorter and shorter, but these are all books I read in the first half of the year and already talked about them a lot in different videos. Okay, what's next? How Do You Live? I got kind of baited into reading this book by the line that it's Miyazaki's favorite book. So I was expecting something magical, something Ghibli-like. Instead of the touching coming-of-age story that I expected, we got a bunch of life lessons, which are oftentimes valuable in themselves, but they did not feel very fleshed out, and it was again a little bit disjointed. So we got more of like scenes of a child's life and their struggles, which even as adults you can relate to it, but there were a lot of fillers. So for example, I distinctly remember this. There was one scene where the characters talk about Napoleon for like 20 pages straight. The whole book I think is like less than 200 pages, so it felt a lot. And yeah, it didn't really live up to my expectations, and I would love to talk with Miyazaki on why this is one of his favorite books. So I finished it, but kind of questioning why, because in the end it did not bring as much value as I thought it would. Back to the top tier. Oh wow, I didn't realize I read this many sequels. Proud of myself for that. Two Twisted Crowns easily goes to the highest tier, not only because it maintained the perfect gothic, misty fantasy atmosphere, but we also got a tortured prince who went from side character to actually main character in the second book, and I loved his character arc and his romantic subplot a lot. Next up, let's go Tempest of Tea. Tempest of Tea, I would say, delivered what it should. The author is the master of writing tension, betrayal, attraction in all of her plots and in all kinds of measures and combinations. And this book is no exception. There is multiple POVs. This was such a fun time. I cannot wait for the sequel. The Midnight Library was actually the monthly book club pick from the company I work at. And not gonna lie, not sure if I would have picked it up otherwise. It's not the usual genre I read. That being said, the concept was interesting. It got kind of repetitive in the middle, and I'm not sure I agree with the ending, but it was a bit of out of a comfort zone read. So for that alone, and for the concept, I would give it a mid-tier, solid mid-tier in my opinion. I feel like the list is getting very mid-tier heavy. I kind of agree with it, like, I think I read a lot of mid books this year. There were a few favorites, a few letdowns, but more like mid-heavy. Something that's definitely not mid is Ruthless Vows. I filmed an entire reading vlog dedicated to it. It's obviously a 5-star read. I will not stop talking about it. This is how you do a sequel, honestly, where you keep the dynamic and the plot still gripping, still new levels of devastating, which I wouldn't have thought it's possible after the first book. But it was just a beautiful, emotional read. Definitely will not stop talking about it. And I think I'm gonna do a reread of it. The whole series is somewhere behind me on that shelf very soon. Talking about romance, I don't read Ellie Hazelwood often, but I was interested in Check and Mate. Did it make me want to pick up more of her books? I cannot say it did, but it did deliver a fun little chess rivals romance, which I enjoyed. So for that alone, I would say Check and Mate delivered what it should. Now I'm kind of approaching like the beginning of the year and the books I read there, and honestly looking back at it, I read good book after good book, which was definitely not the trend in the middle of the year. As you might have realized, like all of these lower rated books I kind of read like in the same 3 to 4 months period. Nevertheless, beginning of the year, I was on a roll. I read Hellbent. It was also a fun sequel in a sense that the plot just somehow drew together in a way that was really satisfying to read. So I would say the sequel delivered exactly what it should. Honestly, rating Hellbent this high just makes it even more sad for me that The Familiar was not an amazing reading experience. Okay, we are down to the last 4 books, very easy ratings. I had The 10,000 Doors of January on my shelf, I think for close to 1 year, 2 years maybe. So I was proud of myself for finally picking it up at the beginning of the year. It was a unique reading experience in a sense that the story is crafted through multiple characters, and it makes the universe of the plot seem endless. Definitely delivered what it should. Recommend it if you're looking for a story which celebrates the beauty of imagination and the power of storytelling as well. Yellowface. Yellowface, this book left me uncomfortable and horrified, but I couldn't look away. I will definitely think and talk about it more in the future because it really stayed with me how it addresses the critique of the publishing industry and also the rise and the fall of trends. So for that alone, Yellowface will sit in the I will not stop talking about these category. No surprise, the Song of Achilles, I will also not stop talking about this book. I said, and this is actually one of my favorite, observations, that if I say that Circe is about the tragedy of immortal and long lives, the Song of Achilles is the tragedy of short and mortal lives with equally beautiful storytelling. Honestly, can recommend it both, even if you're not into historical fiction all that much. And to end it on a high note, I will place Thrown in the Dark also in the highest tier because it breaks conventional fantasy romance storytelling, sometimes even breaking the fourth wall with the reader, and it makes it an enjoyable and fun little read next to all of these maybe heavier on the emotional side or on the world building side fantasy books. So there we go, all 35 books tier ranked. Would I change anything last minute? No, I think I'm happy where I put all the books for now. This might change in a couple of months when I really think back on them and when the reading experiences had time to settle and maybe I remember things differently. But for now, I am happy with these ratings. Let me know if you read any of these books I just talked about and how you rated them. Let me know what were your highlights and biggest letdowns of your reading year. Let's chat in the comments. See you in my next video. Until then, take care. Bye! I fell asleep. Oh.